On the far edge of eastern Kentucky, there are towns that haven't disappeared, but are no longer truly alive. The coal mines are closed. Jobs are dwindling. People wake up each morning not to dream, but to calculate how much longer they can survive. There, the Black Hollow textile mill stood silently like a scar that would never heal. No one was proud of it, but no one dared turn their back on it either. By day, it looked old and weary. At night, it still breathed. The humming of the machinery echoed in the darkness, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of a creature that had lived too long. Many families here grew up with that sound. Children studied to the noise of machines. Adults dozed off after night shifts, their clothes still smelling of grease and chemicals. Black Hollow wasn't a dream, but something that kept dinner on the table. September 2001 arrived in a somber atmosphere. The sky was gray, the wind low, and the rain came and went. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, afraid that if one more thing fell, everything would be irretrievable. And amidst that weariness, no one thought of tragedy. No one thought of loss. Black Hollow was just an old factory, a place where people came to work and then went home. But there are places that, after decaying long enough, don't just hold memories, they begin to hold people. Inside Black Hollow, the night shift begins slowly, a routine worn down by years. The machinery vibrates, not loudly, not violently, just enough to remind us that the factory is still alive. Fluorescent lights cast a pale yellow glow on the concrete floor, making everything look older, more weary. Ethan and Huck walked toward the boiler room, where the heat radiated steadily like an unending fever. Luis checked the conveyor belts in the dyeing room, the familiar smell of chemicals clinging to his clothes. Travis, holding the temperature gauge, stepped into the darker passageways, where the sound of the machinery echoed more hollowly and deeply than usual. No one was in a hurry. No one panicked. Any strange sounds, if they arose, were drowned out by the familiar hum of the machinery. The lights in a corner of the hallway flickered a few times before stabilizing. A slight tremor ran across the floor, just like hundreds of times before. In Black Hollow, everything could vibrate, could make noise, could malfunction, and people learned to ignore it and continue working. Outside, the night sky hung low over the town. No strong wind, no rain, just a heavy, indescribable atmosphere. At home, family members were beginning to sleep, believing this night shift would pass like any other. None of the four knew that it was precisely this normalcy that was the most terrifying thing, because when tragedy arrives in silence, it gives no warning. It simply waits for people to become accustomed to its rhythm, then quietly closes off all paths of return. Inside Black Hollow, the night shift began like hundreds of nights before. No sirens, no major incidents, just the familiar sounds of metal, gears, and steam blending together, creating a rhythm that even long-time workers barely hear anymore. Ethan and Huck ventured deep into the boiler room, where the temperature was consistently several degrees higher than the rest of the plant. Heat radiated from the old pipes, carrying a pungent metallic smell. They exchanged a few brief words, the kind of conversation one would have with someone who had worked together long enough to not need much explanation. Luis stayed in the dyeing room, bending down to check the conveyor belt and control panel. The pressure gauge fluctuated slightly, then stopped, a phenomenon so familiar that no one even noted it anymore. Travis went alone, carrying the temperature monitor through the darker corridors, where the dim lights and the echoing sounds of the machinery were deep and hollow. He paused for a few seconds, watching the needle move up and down, thinking it was just another erratic workday. A light bulb flickered at the end of the hallway. There was a slight vibration running across the floor, enough to be felt but not enough to worry. At Black Hollow, such signs appeared daily. People got used to them, learned to ignore them, because if they stopped because of every little anomaly, no shift would ever finish on time. Outside, night fell silently over the town. At home, their loved ones began to drift off to sleep, believing everything was proceeding as usual. Unbeknownst to them, these seemingly insignificant details were quietly lining up, little by little, preparing for a moment of no return. The next morning arrived earlier than usual. A pale light filtered through the tall, dust-covered windows, illuminating Black Hollow, as if relighting a place where the lights had been left on the night before. The day shift manager opened the familiar side door and stepped inside with the demeanor of an ordinary morning. But the moment he stepped through the threshold, he stopped. The air inside was colder than outside, cold in an unnatural way. The machinery was still running at a low speed, emitting a steady, patient hum, as if the entire factory had been awake all night and were unaware that something was wrong. The ceiling lights were still on, a few bulbs crackling softly. No one had turned them off. He walked down the main corridor. No greetings, no footsteps, only the familiar sounds of machinery and metal fumes. Near a drum, a walkie-talkie lay on the floor, its antenna tilted to one side, as if someone had hastily placed it down and forgotten about it. In the break room, 4 lunchboxes were neatly arranged on a shelf. One was still cold, the ice not yet completely melted. The sight made him pause. Night shift workers never skip meals like that. As he checked the timesheets, his hand lingered longer than usual. Ethan Ward, Luis Ramirez, Dale Hutchkins, Travis Boone. They had all swiped their cards last night. Not a single swipe out. No break. No end of shift. It was as if time had stopped the moment they walked into the office. He called out their names, one by one, his voice echoing in the steel and concrete space before fading away. There was no answer. As he walked the length of the factory, he saw no sign of an accident. No collapse, no blood, no chaos. Everything was in its place, eerily clean. It was then that the real worry began to form. Not the worry of a manager, but the instinct of a human being realizing that something fundamental had disappeared. Humanity. At 8:03 a.m., he called the sheriff's office, and when he hung up, he stood in the middle of the factory, breathing steadily, understanding that some mornings bring no answers. They bring only silence, heavier than any noise. The 2 deputy sheriffs arrived at Black Hollow expecting a brief inspection. They thought of a mix-up. They thought of someone leaving early. They thought of some simple explanation that would emerge when the door opened. But as soon as they stepped inside, both instinctively slowed down. The factory was too quiet for the machinery to be running. The hum of the engines was steady, neither hurried nor chaotic, as if everything were proceeding according to plan. It was precisely this stillness that made the space seem distorted. The people had disappeared, but the machines had not. They checked the parking lot first. 4 pickup trucks were still there. The keys were still in the ignition. The windows were covered in morning fog. There were no footprints leading away. No unfamiliar tire tracks. Everything was still, like a hastily taken photograph. Inside, they went straight to the boiler room. The temperature was still high, but not exceeding the limit. The valves were stable. A maintenance log hung on the wall, the last line recording the time from last night, in the familiar handwriting of someone who had once stood there. After that, there was nothing more. They walked up the catwalks, looking down at the rows of cameras, their lights reflecting off the old metal. On the floor, the smell of chemicals and grease hung in the air as usual. There was no sign of an accident, no cries for help, nothing to suggest that the 4 had tried to leave the place. When their names were called out in the vast space, the police officer's voice echoed and was then swallowed up. The feeling at that moment was no longer one of investigation. It was the feeling of people standing in a place that refused to reveal what it knew, a place that remained silent, even though the inner workings were relentless. When the sniffer dogs were brought to Black Hollow, many believed that the factory would finally open up. These dogs had tracked missing people through deep forests, across streams, and over dozens of kilometers of rocky terrain. They were rarely wrong. They started working immediately. Their noses touched the floor, moving slowly through the break room, along the maintenance corridor, around the dying area. The scent trail was clear and consistent, as if the four men had only been there a short while ago. The deputy officers exchanged glances, holding their breath. Then the dogs led them toward the loading dock behind the factory. On the gravel, they sped up, pulling their leashes taut, determined as if they had found the way. But after only a few steps, they all stopped at the same time. It wasn't because the scent faded. It wasn't because the wind changed direction. Their noses touched the ground, circled for a few seconds, then stood still. The scent trail ceased completely, abruptly, as if someone had cut an invisible thread. The trainer shook his head slightly. He said he had never seen a scent trail end like that. People don't vanish into thin air. Scents don't just disappear on their own. At that moment, one thing became clear. The four men hadn't left Black Hollow in the usual way, and the factory, somehow, had kept something that shouldn't have. Outside the Black Hollow fence, time dragged on painfully, slowly. Families began arriving early in the morning, standing in small groups, no one speaking loudly, as if afraid to shatter some fragile remnant. They gazed at the side door, where the four men had entered the night before, waiting for it to open and return what rightfully belonged to them. Ethan's wife clutched the family photo, her fingers tracing her husband's face, as if to remind herself that he was real, that he was still somewhere very close. Travis's mother stood a little further away, her eyes fixed on the building, as if turning away would mean the worst would happen. She had left the porch light on all night, and even now, she wasn't ready to believe that her son wouldn't be coming home. Luis's sister clutched her phone, staring repeatedly at the dark screen. Each time it vibrated with a meaningless notification. Her heart ached, then sank as she realized it wasn't the call she needed to answer. Huck's brothers stood close to the fence, their voices low and sharp, a mixture of anger and fear. They knew the factory was dangerous, but they never imagined it could be so silent. The whole community gradually gathered. Some brought coffee, others brought chairs, some just stood still, strangers but unwilling to leave. Black Hollow was no longer just a factory. It had become a center of anticipation, where all eyes were fixed, hoping to find a sign of life. But the door remained closed. The machines inside continued to run, and outside, those people began to understand that sometimes waiting brings no hope, only a growing fear with each passing hour. When there were no answers, people began to invent their own explanations. Within days, Black Hollow was no longer the scene of the crime, but a breeding ground for rumors. Stories spread from breakfast diners, from Sunday church, from whispered conversations behind people's backs. Some said the factory had a secret underground level, old passageways never marked on blueprints. Others claimed to have heard a loud metallic crash that night, possibly a floor collapse. Still others suspected internal conflict, an escalating argument during the night shift. But each hypothesis, when brought to light and investigated, quickly crumbled. The police returned to the factory again and again. They measured the floors, knocked on the walls, checked every door lock. No sinkholes, no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains. Nothing to suggest that the four people had been forcibly taken away. Everything was so clean it was unnerving. The lines of inquiry opened and closed. An old acquaintance vaguely remembered a rarely used corridor, but upon checking, it had been locked for years. A truck driver claimed to have seen a strange vehicle parked behind the factory, but no one else could confirm it. Each lead ended the same way, abruptly, empty. The police chief finally had to admit to the press that they were facing a wall. There was no evidence of leaving, no evidence of forced entry, no reasonable explanation. And it was this very impasse that terrified the community, because if four men could disappear right in their workplace, amidst the lights and the noise of the machinery, then no one could be sure anything was safe. Black Hollow didn't just keep secrets, it refused to reveal any truth. In 2005, Black Hollow Textile Mill officially closed. No end of shift whistle, no farewell ceremony. Just one morning, the iron gates were locked, and the factory ceased to breathe before the eyes of the entire town. For many, it meant losing their jobs. For the family of 4 men, it meant losing their last remaining pillar of hope. While the factory was still operating, at least people believed that somewhere inside, an answer awaited discovery. But when the assembly line stopped, when the lights went out, when no one came and went each day, Black Hollow became a giant, silent mass, a place that no longer answered any questions. The windows began to crack. The wind blew through the empty corridors, carrying a long, mournful whistling sound. Grass grew through the cracked concrete. The signs faded, the letters peeling off. Time did what investigation couldn't. It eroded everything. The case gradually changed shape. It was no longer an urgent search, but a lingering wound. People talked about it less, but no one truly forgot. Whenever they passed the abandoned factory, their eyes would unconsciously glance at it, as if afraid that the memories would return if they looked too long. For the victims' families, time does not heal. It only prolongs the pain. Ethan's children grew up with unanswered questions. Luis's family flew back to Kentucky less and less frequently, each trip heavier than the last. Huck's brothers lived with a rage they couldn't vent. Travis's mother continued her habit of waiting for her son, even though she knew she was waiting for something that might never happen. Black Hollow, at this moment, is no longer just a factory. It has become a symbol of everything this town has lost: jobs, hope, and 4 people who vanished without explanation. A scar lies within the community, silently reminding us that there are pains that don't need to be spoken of daily, yet are present in every breath of this place. 14 years passed without a fuss, no turning points, no miracles, just days following one another, so quietly that people thought the pain had become accustomed to being forgotten. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't mentioned anymore either. It existed in a different state, like a locked room that everyone knew was there, but no one wanted to open. Occasionally, a glimmer of hope would appear: an anonymous phone call, a vague account from someone who used to work at the factory, a bone found in the woods, holding the town's breath for days before it was revealed to be just an animal skeleton. Each time, the family would gather, their hearts pounding, only to disperse again in the familiar disappointment. Ethan's wife kept her husband's old phone, its battery dead, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She said that if he ever called, she wanted to be the first to hear it. Luis's family returned to Kentucky less often, but whenever there was a rumor, they still called to inquire, their voices a mixture of hope and apprehension. Huck's brothers shifted from anger to weariness, like people who had run out of energy to complain. Travis's mother was different. She never stopped waiting. She attended every community meeting, carrying a faded photograph of her son. The town has changed too. Newcomers don't know the story. Children hear about Black Hollow as a strange, abandoned place, not the scene of a real tragedy. But for those who have lived here since 2001, each time they drive past the old factory, there's a familiar, unsettling feeling. 14 years, and still no answers. Only small glimmers of hope, repeatedly dashed in disappointment. And in that silence, Black Hollow continued to stand still, as if it knew that the truth was still very close, just not yet ready to be seen. In early 2015, a decision was made in the county meeting room, brief and administrative. Black Hollow would be demolished. The reasons were all too familiar: dangerous, deterioration, no longer usable. To many, it was simply the removal of a decaying concrete structure that had stood there for too long. But for the families, the decision resonated like a pounding heartbeat. Demolition meant the end. If the factory still held anything, if the truth was still trapped somewhere between the steel and the concrete, this was the last chance for it to be revealed. And if nothing was there, then the last door of hope would close forever. News spread quickly through the town. Some breathed a sigh of relief, because finally the haunting place was gone. Others felt a heavy weight in their chests, as if they were about to witness a belated funeral. The victims' families didn't object, but they weren't relieved either. They faced a choice no one wanted to make: keep a place of pain, or demolish it and accept that the answers might remain buried forever. When the first construction machines made their way toward Black Hollow that summer, no one knew that, beneath the old concrete, a truth had been waiting for 14 years, only to be revealed at an unexpected moment. The third day of demolition unfolded like any other. The clanging of metal, the rumbling of heavy engines, and the swirling concrete dust in the summer sun. The workers went about their routine, oblivious to the fact that they were approaching a moment that would change everything. The bulldozer moved slowly across the old factory floor. The operator felt a strange vibration beneath the tracks. Not the hollow feeling of decaying concrete, but a deeper emptiness, as if the ground beneath wasn't familiar soil. He hesitated for a moment, then lowered the rake. At that moment, the floor cracked. Not cracked, but collapsed straight down. The machine wobbled, plummeting several meters amidst the echoing sound of shattering concrete throughout the construction site. Thick dust rose, obscuring everything. The operator shut off the machine, his heart pounding, shouting for help, believing he had just fallen into an old mine. As the dust settled, the truth slowly and heavily emerged. Beneath the concrete was not earth and rock. It was an empty space, a room, a lower level that none of them had ever known. Old walls, rusty pipes, a space sealed off for years, lay silently beneath where hundreds of people had walked every day. Construction immediately stopped. A cordon was put up. The police were called. Rumors spread through the town faster than patrol cars. Some said they saw bones. Others said it was a secret cellar. But for the families who had waited 14 years, the feeling was one and the same. The silence was finally broken, and Black Hollow, after all these years, was forced to reveal what it had hidden deepest beneath its feet. As the investigators descended the makeshift staircase one by one, no one spoke a word. The interior was colder than the outside, not because of the temperature, but because of a sense of being detached from time. Flashlights swept across the rough concrete walls, rusty pipes, and long dead control panels. Everything was still, as if this place had never been allowed to exist. Then, the light stopped. In a corner of the room, beneath a tangled mass of metal pipes, lay what no one wanted to see, but which everyone knew would be there: 4 skeletons. Not lying next to each other, not in any particular order, each in a different position, as if in their final hours they had tried to find their own way to survive in the same inescapable room. One skeleton lay pressed against the wall, its bones tilted forward. Another lay near an old control panel, as if it had once tried to reactivate something. A third slumped onto the concrete floor, its hand reaching out hopelessly into the void. The last one was partially concealed beneath a section of poured pipe, silent and still. Surrounding them were small, everyday objects that brought tears to everyone's eyes. A dented metal lunchbox, still bearing the marks of a rotten apple from years ago. A scratched thermos flask. A clock stopped at an unknown time. An old wallet, still containing faded photographs of wives and children, of family, of faces unaware that the people in the pictures had disappeared 14 years earlier. There were no signs of violence, no chaos, only the heavy silence of a place where people had stayed too long and never left. Those present understood that this was no longer a missing person case. This was a belated answer to 14 years of waiting. Outside the fence, as the news spread, some people collapsed. Some covered their faces and wept. Some stood silently, unable to utter a word. Finally, Black Hollow gave them back. Not in life, but in truth. And that truth, however painful, was what the families had longed for over a decade. As the forensic team examined the scene, a small but haunting detail brought everyone to a halt. On the rusted metal surface of an old pipe, there were faint scratches, not the wear and tear of time, not the marks of mechanical impact. They were deliberate, shaky, yet resolute scratches. When illuminated more brightly, those scratches revealed letters. EW. Nearby, on another steel plate, was LR. And lower, near the cold concrete floor, was TB. 3 clusters of letters. 3 traces humans tried to leave behind in those hours when no one could hear them anymore. Not a signature, not a prank. It's a final attempt to be remembered. To say that we were here, we existed, we didn't simply disappear. No one knows exactly when they carved those words. Perhaps it was when hope still lingered. Perhaps it was when they began to understand that the door would never open again. But what is certain is that, in that suffocating darkness, they were still thinking of their families, thinking of their names, thinking of not wanting to become anonymous figures buried under concrete and silence. When this news reached the family, some burst into tears immediately. Others fell silent for a long time, because those letters were not just evidence. They were a message that transcended 14 years, reminding them that, until their last moment, they were still human, still loved, and still hoped that someone, someday, would find them. As the truth began to piece together, the fragmented fragments of the past 14 years finally found their place. Not an elaborate conspiracy, not a villain lurking in the shadows, but a familiar, repeated series of mistakes, so commonplace that no one considered them dangerous anymore. Experts determined that the boiler system experienced overpressure that night. The sudden surge in steam and heat was enough to activate emergency mechanisms installed decades earlier. These mechanisms, once considered life-saving, had, over time, become undetected traps. Maintenance records show that for years, engineers noted weak valves, unstable pressure, and corroded pipelines. Comprehensive repair proposals were submitted and then dismissed, all for the same familiar reason: lack of budget. Another year of delay, then another year. When the incident occurred, the 4 men did exactly what they had been taught. They reacted according to old procedures, heading to the area listed as safe in an emergency manual from the 70s, the mechanical room below. But they had no idea that it had long been abandoned, sealed off, and most importantly, had no escape route. The automatic door above closed when the pressure reached its limit. There were no handles inside, no ventilation, no external signal. Amidst the deafening roar of the machinery above, any cries for help were drowned out. Experts believe they didn't die immediately. Evidence in the room suggests movement, attempts to find air, an escape route, and hope. They stayed together in a space no one should have been allowed to enter. That truth left many speechless. Because this tragedy didn't stem from a single moment of violence, but from years of underestimating risks, from small decisions signed hastily, and from the mistaken belief that if nothing had happened yet, everything would be safe. Once the cause was clear, the question was no longer what happened, but who allowed it to happen. Old documents were brought to light: maintenance records, inspection reports. Familiar signatures lay dormant on paper, now heavy with a suffocating weight. Warnings were issued, recommendations were sent, but time and time again, everything was postponed. The reasons are repeated over and over, like a habit: lack of budget, wait until next year, not urgent. These seemingly harmless decisions, over time, have piled up into a wall of neglect. No one intentionally killed anyone, but many people chose not to look the danger in the eye. Families entered the legal proceedings feeling more weary than angry. 14 years of waiting had drained most of their energy from resentment. They listened as lawyers explained civil liability, the limits of criminal prosecution, and the fact that no one would ever have to stand trial again. Justice, if it existed at all, came only in the form of documents and numbers. The case ended in a settlement. There was no grand trial, no shocking verdict, just the belated acknowledgement that the deaths of those 4 men could have been avoided. For many in the town, it was never enough. But for the victims' families, however bitter it was the first time in 14 years They had heard something that came close to the truth. Not an apology, not compensation, but an affirmation that those they loved had not disappeared in vain. Justice had arrived, but too late, and it could not bring anyone back. When all the procedures were closed, when the demolition machinery left, and Black Hollow was nothing but an empty plot of land, what remained was not relief. It was silence. A necessary silence so that the people who had waited 14 years could breathe for the first time, even if that breath was still shaky. On the edge of the old plot of land, a small tombstone was erected. Not tall, not ostentatious, just enough for the four names to be clearly engraved, as they had once tried to engrave their names in the darkness. The family arrived in silence. No speeches, no cameras lurking, only slow footsteps and hands gently touching the cold stone. Ethan's son, now much older than the last memory of his father, set down his old work gloves. Luis's sister stood for a long time, her fingers tracing each letter, as if to make sure her brother's name was finally in the right place. Huck's brothers carried a tool, its handle worn, and placed it near the base of the tombstone. Travis's mother stood silently, head bowed, whispering something only she could hear. No one said the pain was gone. It wasn't gone, but the truth, finally, was revealed. No more rumors, no more unanswered questions. They knew where the person they loved was, what they had been through, and that they hadn't been forgotten. A gentle breeze swept across the open ground. Grass began to grow where concrete and steel once stood. Black Hollow was no more. But the story of the four men remained, not as a mystery, but as a reminder that some truths are buried deep, but when brought to light, they carry with them the most precious things: justice for memory and a final farewell. The story of Black Hollow doesn't end with a capture, nor a clear moment of victory. It ends with the truth. A slow, heavy, but necessary truth. The four men didn't disappear. They were there for 14 years, right at everyone's feet, waiting to be seen, waiting to be called by name. This tragedy reminds us that danger doesn't always come from the unusual. Sometimes it arises from things that are too familiar: an outdated procedure, a delayed fix, a decision thought to be put off. And then, when everything collapses, the human cost is always the price. If you're listening to this story, take a moment to think of Ethan, Luis, Huck, and Travis. Think of the little habits they brought with them on that night shift and never had the chance to repeat. If you believe stories like this need to be told, need to be remembered, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share your feelings in the comments. Which moment in the story haunted you the most? The sound of the machinery still running in the empty factory? The scent trail abruptly cut off? Or the letters etched into the metal like a final call from the darkness? The truth may come late, but when it does, the most important thing is that we don't turn our backs on it.